So we're going to be talking about non-medical interventions or things that aren't prescribed or managed by a doctor. So this is all stuff that people can seek outside of medicine. So my name is Lily Rolfe. I use they, them pronouns.
I'm Maya. I use she, her pronouns. I'll be talking about social supports today.
My name's Julie. I use she and they pronouns, and I'll be talking about different methods that people can use to change their gender expression.
We also have some slides by Elena, who wasn't able to make it today. Overall disclosures. We have like no formal disclosures. We are listing some projects or some products and images of products and basically general price ranges. We put these in here just so you can have an idea, a concept of what exists in price ranges, just so you can get a gauge of how expensive things are in case you do want to recommend these to any future people or patients or anyone else that you know. No product is being paid to be here. Starting off, we talked about this a little bit briefly in the mental health and minority stress workshop, but most of the non-medical intervention stuff falls under stuff that can be described as gender expression. Gender expression is different from gender identity. If you remember, gender identity is your like innate sense of self and your gender. Gender expression tends to be how you share that to the world. And changes to your gender expression can be a part of a trans person's social transition and a source of gender euphoria. You have to keep in mind, though, that what you perceive to be something that you associate with a certain gender doesn't necessarily belong to that gender. It's not gender locked. So because you notice somebody who is masculine person but is wearing has their nails painted, that doesn't indicate that they might be trans. They can just be wearing nail polish, for example. That's my common example. Nail polish shouldn't be gender gated anyway. Some basic steps of gender expression, how it can be expressed, many different ways. Basically anything external that somebody can look at you and see. So clothing and accessories, hair, whether it's hairstyle, hair cut, or hair dye, makeup, body modifications, tattoos, piercings, how you move, how you use your body language, and so much more.
So the first thing I'm going to talk about is binding, which includes various methods of compressing breast tissue to give the appearance of a flat chest. So the image on the right is a commercially available chest binder, while the image on the left is visual demonstration of chest taping, which are two different methods. So there are a lot of options when it comes to choosing how you want to bind. Like I mentioned, commercially available binders are on the market. These are typically the most comfortable and also the easiest to use, but also can be the most expensive, ranging up to $60. Other options include neoprene and compression wear, high compression supports bras, as well as taping. And taping specifically requires some more considerations. Avoiding duct tape is primarily one for the purposes of skin protection. It's very restrictive and very adhesive and can damage the skin, as well as nipple protection needs to be used with taping. The thinner areolar skin is more prone to tears, and people who bind should wear nipple covers. There are a lot of positive effects of binding, including increased confidence and self-esteem, as well as decreased gender dysphoria and increased gender euphoria, all of which can combine to decrease anxiety in patients who bind. There are some common considerations and side effects of binding. There's been one large study that surveyed about 1,800 trans people and reported some adverse symptoms and rates. Most common being musculoskeletal, including back pain, chest pain, and worsening posture, but also included things like overheating, itching, rash, acne, and in some cases, rare events like rib fracture and skin infection that happen in less than 5% of people who bind. In general, what moderates the number of side effects or the severity of side effects that people who bind have is the amount of time that they bind. So daily, long-term, and long hours of binding increases the chance of worse side effects. 97% of respondents reported having at least one side effect out of the list that they surveyed. And we'll send out the link to this paper as well afterwards in case people want to look at it. So 97% of people reported at least one of the side effects they surveyed, but the more severe were associated with longer binding practices. So there's ways that as providers we can counsel our patients about how best to bind. So most patients want to discuss safe binding practices with their provider. And if you know a patient binds, it's important to ask them about how they do it, for how long, and things like that. So here are some recommendations that generally go with binding. Proper sizing is important to keep in mind, and binding shouldn't be painful. Binding should also be avoided with exercise as well, particularly tight binding, avoiding that with exercise. Patients should also take breaks from binding every 8 to 12 hours, and not sleeping in binders is also important. The last thing is proper washing and proper binder removal, especially when using tape. Removal of the tape gently is important, as well as the use of nipple covers, as well as frequent washing of cloth or neoprene binders. The internet is a great place for resources on binding. So we have some right here. There's guides to how best to bind, recommendations for binding online, as well as handouts that you can give to patients if you print them out. There's also lottery programs that can provide free binders to people in the US under 24 based on a lottery. Yeah, the next method that people use to change their gender expression is tucking. So this encompasses various methods of retracting the penis and testes to create a flat space between the legs. It can be used, again, to alleviate gender dysphoria, for aesthetic purposes, or for gender affirmation. So in general, tucking includes 3 steps. The first is inversion, demonstrated in the picture on the top, which is the return of the testes to the inguinal canal or movement to the side. The second step is retraction, demonstrated in the picture on the bottom, which is pulling the penis and scrotum posteriorly to keep the testes in place and to create a flat surface. And the final step is fixation, in which the tuck is held in place with tape, compression underwear, or what is called a gaff, which is compression underwear meant to be worn with tucking. And on the right is a picture of a gaff. So in terms of side effects and recommendations for tucking, most patients, again, want to talk about safe practices. And if you know a patient tucks, it's important to ask about it. Some recommendations include tuck breaks. So tucking in general, you want to do for less time than you'd want to bind. In general, 4 to 8 hours is recommended, never over 8 usually. For longer term, regular tucking, gentler methods like tight underwear or gaffs are recommended. As well, if patients use tape to tuck, hypoallergenic medical tape and proper hair removal is important, just to sort of minimize irritation. And finally, some of the risks included with tucking are UTIs, testicular torsion or inflammation, skin irritation or rashes, and numbness. And it's important that if people who tuck notice any of these, that they stop tucking, and if they persist for a while, to see a medical professional. And yeah, the final thing I'm going to talk about is prosthetics. And I'll go over questions at the end too. So these include padding and packing. So it can be the use of prosthetics or shapewear to modify the body's appearance. And this one, there's a wide variety of ways that people can do this. Everything from DIY at home methods to things that are commercial and cost hundreds of dollars. So there's really a wide range of things that you can do with prosthetics. The first one that I'm going to go over is padding. So this encompasses everything from breast enhancers, breast forms, and hip pads. In general, the health recommendations of this are mainly skin and soft tissue related. So washing pads regularly and taking breaks from padding are important to keep in mind, as well as checking skin areas for rashes or acne, as well as being mindful of overheating while padding. The next use of prosthetics is commonly packing. So this is the use of a non-flesh penis or penile prosthetic in one's underwear. And these can be either anatomical or non-anatomical, commercial or DIY. There's a lot of variation in the options that people have. There's also varying functions of packers. So they can either be used for appearance alone. There are devices that allow the wearer to stand to pee or the wearer to use during intercourse. And again, primary consideration with packing is washing regularly, especially if the device is being used for urination or intercourse, requires regular maintenance and upkeep, as well as hypoallergenic materials and checking for rashes or acne. This is the last section I have. So one of the questions that I got was if there was any risk to fertility with tucking. There haven't been any studies definitively linking tucking and fertility. However, testicular inflammation and overheating that can be associated with persistent tucking could create this as a side effect, which is why it's important to advise patients not to tuck for more than 8 hours.
Next part of general gender expression stuff, I'm going to talk a little bit about hair removal. It's, again, an optional part of social transitioning, frequently for trans feminine people. Typically, what is generally targeted is the face, because there tends to be some facial hair or facial follicles there that grow in thicker in folks who are AMAB if they didn't get on puberty blockers and went through their testosterone-fed puberty. There are two typical popular methods for hair removal: electrolysis and laser hair removal. So we'll go briefly over these. The unfortunate thing about hair removal is that it tends to be less likely covered by insurance for gender affirmation, although there are some states and some insurance plans that do cover hair removal. Hair removal is also an important part of a lot of the surgical options that we talked about last Monday, specifically for bottom surgery. So first thing we're going to talk about is electrolysis. So it uses a device called an epilator, it is a device with a thin wire, which basically you go into each little hair follicle, you shock it, and you do an electrical current, which damages the hair follicle and leads to permanent hair removal. This, like the laser hair removal, it can take multiple sessions. It's very, very expensive and can be difficult to get covered by insurance, but it tends to have less side effects than laser. So there's less post-procedure skin irritation, there's low but possible risks of scarring, and since you are directly putting this device into each hair follicle, you can kind of do it on folks where laser hair removal might not be as good of an option. Speaking of laser hair removal, this is using basically lasers and very high intensity lights to damage the hair follicles. It mainly slows hair growth, but it's not necessarily permanent. A lot of people will find after they get laser hair removal, they will have hair that grows back, but typically it is a little bit finer and thinner and less noticeable. Laser hair removal does have several things that make it not ideal for all people. It typically is safest and most effective for folks with fair and light skin and relatively dark pigmented hair roots. And it doesn't really work at all for folks with very fine blonde hair or red hair. If you have darker complexion or red hair or are super, super blonde, you might have to go the more expensive electrolysis routes. Considerations and side effects: there can be some immediate pain and irritation with this. You can get inflammations, blisters, burns, hyperpigmentation, hypopigmentation, scarring. This is also a lot of money. It's less than electrolysis, but still a decent chunk. And both of these will require multiple sessions because how hair works is everything is kind of in different growing stages all at once. So you can get kind of what's there and growing at that time, and then there'll be new hair follicles growing shortly thereafter. So you need to kind of catch all of them in their innate little growing periods. So most of these will take several sessions in order to get the hair loss that you're looking for. Another fun thing we're going to talk about is voice therapy. There are many different reasons why somebody might want to change their voice. There could be folks who have voice dysphoria or incongruence, which can also sometimes leave lead to safety concerns because we live in a society that isn't always safest for trans people. So if you are dressed pretty femininely, but you have a low voice, it might make the world a more dangerous place for you. It could also just be that you want to celebrate voice euphoria. Voice therapy is fun because it kind of lives between social and medical transition. And so you are working with a healthcare professional most of the time to help modulate your voice, but you could also seek it out by yourself. You can explore this without much negative side effects if you yourself want to go and hear what your voice would sound like if you decided to go up a pitch or down a pitch. That is something you can very easily do without any long-term effects. Allows you to explore your gender, especially if you're kind of in the questioning stages, or you want to play around with accents and have fun. Your voice is complicated. There's a lot going on. There is the option to do vocal surgery, which is a surgery that we didn't really cover in the surgery talk, but it basically just kind of narrows the vocal cords and makes it so it raises the pitch. But that itself can raise the pitch. But besides pitch, there's many other things that can make a voice sound what we as society tends to think as more feminine or masculine. This can be things like the pitch of your voice, the volume of your voice, the resonance. You can have like a bright sounding voice or a dark sounding voice. I'm very bad at showing you what these sound like, but there are many, many different resources online that can show you the difference. So I will link a few later on. Speech patterns, people talk differently, and maybe you want to try out a different speech pattern or the language that people use. There is trained speech and language therapists that can help work with people to help find their preferred voice, assuming that you want to work on your voice. Typically, this is a process that'll take between 4 to 12 months. You'll often meet once a week. Most of the practice happens at home, and it works best if you have a safe space to train. If you're not necessarily living in a safe location or you're not out to your family yet, and you're worried about them overhearing you and having questions, it can be a little bit more dangerous. But if you have like a place that you can go to and talk to, that's great. There's also a lot of wonderful resources online. A great thing about the trans community is that there's a huge online and supportive trans presence. So there are wonderful voice lessons that you can talk through where you can hear the differences between resonance and pitch, and they'll give you training exercises on how you can talk. However, with the speech and language pathologist, you can get that immediate feedback right away. So that can be beneficial and help you. Now the very, very complicated legal transition phase of things. So I call this the bureaucratic headache section. It differs by state. There's no one governing thing that makes it very easy to change your name and gender marker. And once you get a state to approve your name change, you then have to present your name change documentation to Social Security. You get a new Social Security card issued, and then you get to go to the DMV and get a new ID issued in your new name. This process can take months. When I did this process myself, and from when I got my name change documentation to when I had my new driver's license in hand was like 4 or 5 months. So very, very long time. And that's after I had the documentation. Is this an easily accessible thing? So this is the US Trans Survey 2015. I talk about this a lot, and this is a graph of people who wanted to have their name or gender updated on their ID and whether or not they were able to get it. As you can see, not a lot of places or not a lot of people have actually updated it yet. And it's significantly easier to get your name updated compared to your gender. Good news, some of these have slightly shifted and the requirements are easier specifically for the passport. So I know we have some folks who are not from Illinois, so apologies. This is kind of an Illinois focused presentation, but we'll first go through, are you allowed to get your name changed? Just to kind of walk you through what the process is. So have you ever convicted, or are you a convicted felon or have been in the past 10 years? Then if you have any sort of conviction on your record, you're just not allowed to change your name. Otherwise, as long as you've lived in Illinois for the past 6 months, regardless of your legal status, you do fit the criteria to change your name, which is pretty nice. Just because the ability to change your name is pretty open in Illinois doesn't mean that it is still an easy thing to do. So currently, you need an affidavit from a quote unquote credible person that you need a name change. Typically, this will be a mental health professional or a doctor, but it's not super well defined. You need to schedule a hearing with a judge. After you schedule your hearing, at least 6 weeks beforehand, you need to publish in the newspaper that you are planning on changing your name for at least 3 consecutive weeks, unless you're under witness protection. This is hypothetically to prevent people from getting into huge amount of debts and then trying to get out of them by changing their name. But it seems a little outdated to me. After you get your newspaper all done, where you've had it there for at least 3 weeks, you finally go to court. You hope that your judge isn't transphobic and will accept your name change. And if you're a minor, you need both parents to give consent for this. This is a pretty expensive process. Can cost up to $388 in court fees, depending on your county. And then you have to do the going rate in Chicago is $90 in the Daily Herald, which is the go-to newspaper for this. Of note, if you get married, that counts as a name change documentation. In Illinois, you can only change your last name, however. There are some states that allow you, when you get married, to just change your whole name without any other paperwork headache. And it does not cost $388. It just costs what a marriage certificate costs. Then we get to the Social Security card. So you show up to the Social Security office. Hopefully it's not been a very long line. Or you can do this online these days. You get your proof of name change documentation. The documentation needs to have your old name and your new name and be like, we're changing this name. You need your old ID. Currently, since COVID, you mail it in and you wait. Luckily, this is a free process. Very nice to the Social Security office. But this was, at least for me, the major hang-up that took several months for it to happen. And you just kind of have to wait until you get your Social Security card. When you do have your Social Security card, then you can go to the DMV and say, hey, I have a Social Security card in my new name. I would like my license to be updated to this name. Also bring your name change documentation in. They might be very confused about this process, but they should be able to change it. In terms of the gender marker on the driver's license, so again, Illinois, this is very dependent on state. So you have states that are very open. They don't need any provider certification to change their gender marker, have a gender neutral option, all the way to basically being impossible to have it changed. We'll go to the next slide after this to let you know some of the states that are a little bit less friendly. Illinois has passed a law that requires there to be a gender neutral X option. This hypothetically won't take place until 2024, so don't rush out and go change your license yet if you are non-binary. And Colorado, which is mentioned on here as one of the A+ gender neutral options, no provider certification required, does require provider certification for minors. From our lovely A+ states, which is 20 states plus Washington, D.C., we go down from being slightly more complicated to you need to have had surgery, or you need to get a court order to the state, or have an amended birth certificate already. Really, really dependent. Luckily, the driver's license gender marker changes tend to be dependent on where you are currently living, not where you were born. So Illinois, pretty easy. You basically just visit the Secretary of State again, say, I am who I say I am. I want to change my name. Here's my name change documentation. I'm going to fill out this gender designation change form, pay the fee, you're good to go. Passports are significantly nicer these days. I think either past couple of years, they changed it so you can just change your gender on your passport, regardless of what currently lives on your driver's license, your birth certificates, or other ID. You don't need any sort of proof that you are the gender that you say you are. You can just write in, I am a male, and then it'll change in your passport. The passport does cost money, So if you're renewing, it's $130, $160 if it's your first time. And if you just got one, I think if it's within like a year of you getting your passport the first time, they might be able to waive the fee on that and have it be like a changing it. But most likely you'll be out the $130. Birth certificates are kind of where it gets complicated. Unfortunately, this is dependent on where your birth certificate was issued, so you are beholden to the state at which you were born in. 2 states don't allow you to change your gender on your birth certificate. 17 require a court order. 15 require you to have surgery, typically bottom surgery. 13 require, quote, appropriate treatment, which is no surgery, but HRT. But sometimes a clinician can put that they are getting appropriate treatment for their gender identity if they are not getting HRT. For example, for non-binary folks, if the clinician believes that is appropriate treatment for them. And 10 states plus New York City, you don't need a provider to sign off on your birth certificate gender. For now, Illinois still requires an affidavit from a licensed healthcare professional or mental health professional saying that you are receiving clinically appropriate treatment for gender transition or has an intersex condition. Just like there are many reasons to legally transition, there are also reasons not to, which everyone is going to have to balance. I sourced this out for you ahead of time. So when talking to people why they didn't want to legally transition, again, this is a very informal poll of a trans Discord that I'm in, and some general resources that I have looked at, but there are many medical treatments that are gender gated by insurance. So if you do change your gender legally, your insurance may no longer cover, say, your pap smear or other more gendered or stereotypically gendered procedures. If you can't get all of your paperwork to match, especially if you are stuck in one of those states that doesn't allow you to change your birth certificate, it can forcibly out you if you ever need to present all of it at once. You also have to go and talk to a judge. And like, luckily, Illinois, Chicago is pretty good, and you can kind of gauge judges ahead of time to make sure you are not getting a transphobic one. But I definitely have friends who will get all the way to court after posting in the newspaper and then have the judge just say no, which is a real bummer. And you can go through the process again, get a different judge, different court, but it's still a whole other process. Since you need to publish in the newspaper, this might cause a dangerous situation for you and out you, because you're basically publishing to the whole public, like, hello, I am going from this masculine sounding name to this feminine sounding name, and you might now be a target. That's not great. While I do love our passport's ability to have an X gender marker, and many states having the X gender marker, if you're traveling to a country that is transphobic or has more stricter trans-related laws, they might not accept them. So there's a lot of concerns with people if you're going to one of those countries, or if you want to travel there for some reason, or you have to travel there, where you might get stopped at the border and not allowed in. It's also a huge headache. It takes months. You have to talk to people and get your letter proving you to say that you are who you're saying you are. It's very expensive. And while a lot of the providers here that I worked with are pretty good at applying or giving people letters saying that they are adequately seeking the medical or adequately getting treatment for their gender transition, even if they are just non-binary, for example, and not on HRT or not wanting to get surgery, it is dependent on your doctor that you're working with, and if the state allows that kind of loophole kind of wording. So if you don't want to do HRT, and this is not just non-binary folks, not all trans folks want HRT or to medically transition either. So you are unable to meet the requirements and you're kind of gatekept from it. And you can also just not want to. This is just changing your legal documentation. It gets even more complicated when you stack in previous degrees. If you are like a healthcare person that has published research, needing to like go through that, like there's a a whole lot of steps and reasons why somebody might not want to. This is not to say that you shouldn't encourage people to get legally transitions. It's just to say that if they decide that they don't want to, you shouldn't think any differently about them. They are still who they say they are and the gender that they are telling you. Now we'll go on to social support.
Yeah, so this section is just about how you can support people, whether it's through their transition process or like as their provider or just people in your life. Hopefully some of this seems sort of obvious. It's kind of like be a good human advice, but we'll also go through some specific provider clinic setting stuff. So like Lily mentioned earlier, this is from the US Transgender survey from 2015. Unfortunately, starting in a sort of grim place. Probably you all are aware of a lot of the legal attacks against the ability of trans youth to express their gender identity across the country. Unfortunately, that also translates to individual experiences of harassment, assault, expulsion from school, both from teachers and classmates. So on that note, we have a list of resources we'll send out at the end of this that is Illinois specific, but helpful anywhere, both for people who work in schools, but also if you encounter youth or adolescents in your practice and want to connect them to some resources related to what their rights are in terms of their expression of their gender within schools, but also connecting them to other trans youth and organizations that can support with advocacy, organizing, and research. Then, yeah, this is sort of the be a good human slide. The first thing on the list is just making sure to center the needs of the person you're talking to and not assume anything about how they want to go about getting care or getting support. Obviously, this whole workshop, we're talking about all the different avenues that you can go through. So everybody's path is going to look different. So just offering kind of different options based on what they are telling you. On that note, using the language that people ask you to use, learning on your own. Everyone is here tonight. So that's an amazing first step. There are also additional resources we'll send out for people in your life. Like we're talking a lot about kind of the logistical hurdles and the like emotional work of having to go through all of that. So supporting with paperwork, appointments, those sorts of things, that can be really helpful. And that's something you can do as a provider too, helping people navigate some of the bureaucracy of all of this. And then encouraging connections with mental health professionals. Unfortunately, we are also aware of the mental health kind of outcomes for especially trans youth. So getting people to connected to supportive mental health professionals can really make a huge difference.
At the end of the workshop, we had everyone brainstorm what is part of their gender expression, and I encourage you, as you watch this video, to also do some self-reflection. And regardless of your gender, think of what you do to express it to the world. We had many wonderful examples, such as hair coloring, hair covering, facial hair, nail polish, branded deodorant, specific clothings like the perfect pants and high-waisted jeans, your voice, tattoos. Basically anything can be a part of your gender expression, and we encourage you to celebrate and discover your own.